Hello, and welcome to the History and Careers podcast. I'm just going to go over, the majority of the important terms and people and all that good stuff that you need to know for the test. And as always, if you need any extra help, you can come in before school or email me or something and ask me any questions you have, and I'll let you know. All right. So to start off, let's talk about the important names you need to know. And really, when we're looking at the ancient historians, philosophers, the Greeks, what you need to know is where they fall on the nature versus nurture side. Obviously, nature being things are inherent, they're innate. It's what you're born with, and nurture being it's all about your environment. And Plato and Aristotle, they both believe that knowledge is the mind. It's all about the mind is your knowledge, and Plato would fall heavily on the nature side. He believed that this knowledge was innate; we were born with it. Whereas Aristotle, on the other hand, would disagree and say that this knowledge is gained through experiences. So Aristotle would lean heavily on the nurture side. And then once again, when you look at the Renaissance philosophers, Descartes and Locke, you got to look at where they're falling on the side of the debate. Locke heavily agrees with Aristotle. He came up with the idea that we're born with a blank slate. He called it a tabula rasa, it's Latin for blank slate, and that everything that happens to us, that's what we become. It's based on our interactions and our experiences. Descartes, on the other hand, he believed in the dualism, the mind-body relationship. He'd more fall heavily on the nature side. As we get into more contemporary psychologists, remember you got to know the difference between Wundt and James. Wilhelm Wundt was the father of psychology, and he started the idea of structuralism, and which sought to obviously seek out the structures of the mind. And his technique was called introspection, and introspection required his patients, if you will, to look inward and report what they were feeling. Not very scientific, so later psychologists rejected his ideas of structuralism, but he's still known as the father of psychology because he set up the first psychology laboratory that tried to explain human behavior based on experimental data. Whereas William James, on the other hand, he's known as the father of modern psychology because he started the idea of functionalism, which sought to see how our mind and our brain interacted with our environment around us. So he's known as the father of modern psychology. Some of the other more contemporary names you need to know: Sigmund Freud. You're going to need to know a lot more about him as we go on throughout the year, but what you need to know for now is his idea of the psychoanalytic theory or psychodynamic. It's one and the same. The whole idea that the unconscious, it's our deepest wants, desires, fears, wishes, all that good stuff. That's what drives our decision making. John Watson and B.F. Skinner, they were strict behaviorists. They rejected the idea of introspection and cognitive thought and all that type of stuff. And behaviorism is all about how our environment shapes our observable behaviors. That's what Watson and Skinner were concerned with. They didn't care about what you thought or what you were born with. It's all about how do we learn from our environment that influences our observable behaviors. And then last but not least, Carl Rogers. He was one of the pioneers of the humanistic approach to psychology. He had a lot of work that helps in client-centered therapy and growth potential and all that stuff. But for now, we're going to get into all this stuff later. For now, you need to know he's one of the pioneers of the humanistic psychology. All right, some things you need to know as far as the modern approaches to psychology. There's obviously, we look at it. The one that encompasses all is called the biopsychosocial perspective. It looks at what you're born with or what your biological factors are, and then it also looks at your social factors, so what's your environment like, and then what's going on while you're thinking, your psychological factors, and it combines all three to explain your behavior or what you're doing in your life. So it's called the biopsychosocial approach to psychology. But there are some more specific approaches you need to know, and we went over 7 in class. The first is biological, and that is how our physical makeup influences our behavior and our thought processes. So biological psychologists will look at, the brain or hormones or anything that has to do with our physical makeup that influences our psychological thinking and behaving. Evolutionary psychology, it's similar to biology in that it looks at our genetic makeup, but that's really as far as it goes. It doesn't look at other things that can influence our biological makeup outside of the genetic aspect of it. So Charles Darwin, obviously, he's the one that started the whole idea of the evolution theory, And so evolutionary psychology ties back to Charles Darwin. The psychodynamic, I already mentioned that with Freud. It's the idea that, the iceberg theory, the tip of the iceberg is what we let people see, but really mostly who we are is our unconscious mind, and that's filled with our deepest desires, wants, wishes, fears, whatever, and we hardly ever let anybody see that. And that's really what drives our behavior. The behavioral, once again, I kind of explained that with Watson and Skinner, but that's how our environment shapes who we are and our observable behaviors. Behaviorists could care less about what you're thinking. It's all about how our environments shape our behaviors, observable behaviors. The cognitive approach is kind of the opposite of behavioral. It's how we use, store, and process information. So in short, it's how we think. So anything that has to do with memory or problem solving or creativity or the way we use language, those are all cognitive processes in the way we use, store, and process information. Humanistic, that's all about growth potential. How can I become better at whatever it is I'm trying to do? So humanistic approach, like I said, I mentioned things like the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Teens or any self-help book. That's humanistic psychology. And then last but not least is the social culture or cross-cultural. They're one and the same. That's the idea that your social upbringing influences who you are. The society you grow up in, the social norms, that will obviously make you think and act in a certain way. If you were raised in Indiana as opposed to China or India or wherever else it might be. So those are the 7 main modern approaches to psychology. There are some, obviously, careers in psychology you need to know. There's a handful of them. Obviously, educational psychologists, they work in school settings. They study, obviously, the relationship between their environment and the learning that takes place in schools, and they also do a lot of assessments for students to make sure they're placed properly and they get the proper accommodations. So if they have ADD or if they're mentally handicapped or if they're gifted or whatever it might be, they'll conduct those tests and make sure they're placed properly and getting what they need in the educational setting. Industrial organizational psychologist, IO psychologist. I told you to think of Michael Scott from The Office, but obviously that's IO psychology gone wrong. They work in the workplace usually in HR, where they're doing things like helping with hiring, helping with team building, helping with job satisfaction, all those type of things. Human factors, that's the one where they work usually with engineers. It's also called ergonomics. They work with our anatomy and our physiology combined with our psychology to make sure products are engineered and designed properly and in the most safe manner. Like I said, remember like the way a car is set up. That a lot of psychology and anatomy and physiology went into the idea of where the pedals are placed, where the stick shift is placed, all that type of stuff. That's what a human factors psychologist does. Counseling psychologist, this is where you go if you're having issues with whatever it might be. Might be home life, might be boyfriend, girlfriend, might be whatever. These are people that can help you through your problems, like your therapists, really. Don't get those confused with clinical psychologists. They do the same thing, but clinical psychologists typically work with people who have diagnosed psychological disorders. So it's more than if you diagnose schizophrenia or whatever it might be, the clinical psychologists typically work with those people. And then also don't get that confused with a psychiatrist. A psychiatrist has an MD, a medical doctorate, and they're typically the only ones who can prescribe medication. So some people might go to a counselor and a psychiatrist. They go to the counselor for the therapy and then the psychiatrist to get the prescription for whatever it might be that they're fighting. You also have forensic psychologists. Like I said in class, think of, Criminal Minds or shows like that where they do criminal profiling. They help with the cops and the FBI to catch the criminals by doing some sort of psychological analysis on the people that they're trying to catch. And then last but not least, you have sports psychologists. They obviously work with athletes to help them with their performance on the field or pitch or whatever it might be. And then you also have psychologists who do research as well. There's a handful of research subfields in psychology. And the first is psychometrics. These are people who have anything to do with quantifiable data. So like IQ testing, for example. If you take a real IQ test, there's ones on the internet and what have you, but those aren't actual real IQ tests. In order to get an actual real certified IQ test done, you have to go to a psychometric psychologist.